June 18, 1944, Philippine Sea, Western Pacific. The night was a black ocean, endless and silent. The only light came from the dull red glow of instruments aboard the USS Lexington, CV-16. Deep inside her Combat Information Center, the CIC, sailors hunched over green screens that flickered like ghosts in the dark. Radar contact, bearing 075. Distance 220 miles, reported Ensign Robert McCauley, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. The faint blip pulsed rhythmically on the SG surface search radar, cutting through the static. Captain Felix Stump, commander of Task Group 58.2, leaned over the scope. 200 miles? That's beyond visual range. Yes, sir, McCauley replied. Multiple returns, large formation. The captain exhaled slowly. Then they're coming. Just like we expected. Outside, the night wind howled over the carrier deck. Radar operators across the fleet were seeing the same thing, faint echoes spreading across there, cathode tubes like ripples in the sea. The Japanese had launched their strike, and they didn't know they were already seen. For years, Imperial Japanese Navy officers had mocked the Allies' reliance on radar. They called it electric magic, a gadget for engineers, not warriors. Real men, they said, trusted their eyes, their instincts, and the sky itself. But radar didn't blink. It didn't sleep. And tonight, it saw everything. 3 hours earlier, 370 Japanese aircraft had taken off from carriers Teihu, Shakaku, and Zuikaku, bound for the American fleet. They flew in tight formation, guided by dead reckoning and faith, across hundreds of miles of open water. Their plan: strike first, crush the U.S. carriers, and save the Empire's last chance at controlling the Pacific. But the Americans were no longer fighting blind. By 1944, every major U.S. carrier group was equipped with airborne early warning and surface radar, connected through a growing network of combat information centers. For the first time in naval history, a fleet could see an enemy long before the enemy even knew they were there. On the radar screens, the Japanese air groups appeared as flickering clusters, invisible to the eye, yet as clear as day to the machines. "Interceptors ready?" asked Captain Stump. Commander John Jimmy Thatch, the air group leader aboard Lexington, nodded. "We'll meet them at 100 miles. The radar men adjusted their dials. The blips on the screen inched closer. Across the fleet, squadrons of F-6F Hellcats roared to life, their engines thundering like rolling surf. Deck crews waved them off one by one, launching into the darkness. Above the ocean, the night split with flame as American fighters climbed into the stars, guided not by searchlights, but by the invisible hand of radar. "God help them," muttered a signalman, watching the streaks vanish into the clouds. "They don't even know what's waiting." Far to the west, aboard the carrier Taihu, the Japanese pilots had no such instruments. Their radio direction finders flickered with static. Compass needles quivered. They flew in formation by instinct, scanning the horizon for a fleet that radar had already marked for death. Americans blind without the sun, their instructor had told them. Strike fast, and they'll never see you coming. They didn't know that in 1944, darkness belonged to the Americans. As the Japanese strike groups crossed the 150-mile mark, a voice cut through the CIC aboard Lexington. "Contact confirmed. 30,000 feet, inbound fast." Captain Stump turned to his radar chief. "Give them the full picture." McCauley grinned faintly, tapping the console. "They'll never make it past our screen, sir." "We'll vector the Hellcats right to them." Stump nodded. "Do it. And Godspeed." Moments later, the first intercept orders went out, relayed from radar stations to fighter controllers, from fighter controllers to the pilots already cutting through the black sky. Above the ocean, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was about to begin, not with eyes, but with signals. The Japanese still laughed at radar. In less than an hour, they would stop laughing forever. June 19, 1944. Morning over the Philippine Sea, the sun rose over the western Pacific, burning away the mist in streaks of gold. Below, the ocean shimmered calm, too calm, as the American fleet stretched in precise formation. Dozens of carriers, battleships, and destroyers carved perfect wakes across the endless blue. On the deck of the USS Lexington, crewmen shielded their eyes from the glare, scanning the sky for the first signs of the enemy. But down below, in the dim green glow of the Combat Information Center, the battle had already begun. Radar contact 120 miles, inbound at Angels 20, came the voice from the operator's station. Captain Felix Stump leaned over the radar scope, his hand steady. Vector the cap to intercept. Let's see if Thatch can make history again. Above the fleet, Commander Jimmy Thatch led 4 divisions of F-6F Hellcats climbing into the sunlight, guided by the invisible hand of radar control. Through his headset came the voice of the radar officer aboard USS Enterprise. Bandits bearing 270. Distance 110 miles. Angels 20. You're cleared to engage. Thatch keyed his mic. Roger that. All units, tighten up. Eyes open, gentlemen. They're coming straight to us. Aboard the Japanese carrier Shokaku, the situation was far less organized. Pilots sweated in their cockpits as they flew low over the sea, searching for the enemy fleet by sight. Their formation had stretched thin. Fuel gauges ticked lower by the minute. American fleet should be near. Radioed Lieutenant Commander Kakuji Kakuda, his voice distorted by static. Spread out. Find them. The problem was, the Americans had already found them. At our 9:30 hours, radar-guided interceptors struck the first wave. From 20,000 feet, the blue-gray shapes of Hellcats descended like thunderbolts. Their 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns opened fire, cutting into Japanese formations before the enemy even realized they were there. Tracer rounds tore through the morning sky. Flames erupted as Zero fighters and Judy dive bombers spiraled into the sea. Splash 1 bandit! Splash 2! They never saw us coming. The air crackled with radio chatter, bursts of static mixing with shouts of triumph and disbelief. Down below, sailors aboard American carriers watched trails of smoke fall toward the horizon. Some cheered. Others just stared, awed by the sheer precision of the radar vectors that had guided their fighters directly into the path of the attackers. By noon, the first wave was obliterated. Of the 70 aircraft launched, fewer than a dozen made it within sight of the American fleet. Most were shot down miles away, killed by machines that could see over the curvature of the earth. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance studied the situation report handed to him by his operations officer. Enemy air groups destroyed before visual contact, the officer said. Hellcats claim over 150 kills in the morning strikes. Spruance nodded slowly. Radar did it again. He turned to his staff. They used to laugh at our gadgets. Let them laugh at the bottom of the sea. But the Japanese still had faith, or perhaps desperation. Another wave launched at midday. Over 120 aircraft from Zuikaku, Hayo, and Junyu, fanning out toward the American fleet. Once again, radar caught them hundreds of miles away. Once again, fighter directors vectored their pilots with mathematical precision. At 20,000 feet, Hellcats tore through the attackers. The sky became a graveyard of smoke trails and falling wreckage. Some American pilots reported shooting down 5 planes in a single engagement. It's like hunting blind birds, one pilot later wrote. They came straight at us, not knowing we'd been waiting all along. By the end of the day, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The Americans had lost fewer than 30. It was the largest one-sided air battle in naval history, and it had been decided long before the first bullet was fired. Because radar had rewritten the laws of war. That evening, as the last embers of sunlight faded over the Philippine Sea, Captain Stump walked the flight deck of Lexington. Wreckage from returning aircraft littered the planks. Mechanics worked in silence beneath red lamps. He paused at the rail, looking out toward the dark horizon. Somewhere beyond it, the Japanese fleet was retreating. Blind, broken, and utterly outmatched. He whispered to himself. They called it a toy. We built a weapon the sky can't hide from. June 20th, 1944. Western Pacific, near the Marianas. The ocean was deceptively calm. Beneath a pale gray dawn, the Japanese carrier group crept eastward, engines throttled low, smoke funnels muffled, hoping to slip back toward home waters. The fleet that had once shattered Pearl Harbor was now a ghost of itself. On the deck of the carrier Zuikaku, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, sailors moved with quiet desperation. Smoke stains streaked her hull. Anti-aircraft guns stood ready, barrels blackened from overuse. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood at the bridge, his binoculars fixed on the horizon. Any sign of the Americans? The communications officer shook his head. None, Admiral. Visual contact zero, Ozawa exhaled. Good, perhaps. A petty officer burst in. Sir, radio intercepts enemy aircraft approaching, bearing 180. Aircraft? Ozawa barked. Impossible. We've seen no reconnaissance planes, no sightings. But by then, it was too late. Far beyond the range of human eyes, the U.S. Task Force 58 had already locked onto them. Radar aboard USS Enterprise Lexington and Bunker Hill had painted the Japanese fleet across a grid of glowing dots to 300 miles away, invisible to the naked eye. The order went out across the fleet. Launch all strike groups. Repeat, all strike groups. Engines roared to life. The carrier decks trembled under the weight of hundreds of aircraft preparing for takeoff. Pilots sprinted to their planes, Sp-2C Helldivers, TBF Avengers, and F-6F Hellcats, their wings unfolding like metallic wings of vengeance. At 16:30 hours, the first wave launched, over 200 aircraft climbing into the blinding sky, guided entirely by radar coordinates. Hours later, the Japanese fleet spotted them at last, not with radar, but with their eyes. Tiny black specks on the horizon, growing larger every second. Klaxons screamed. Anti-aircraft gunners rushed to stations. Shells exploded in red blossoms across the sky. The Americans dove in formation, cutting through flak like hawks through fog. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, led the charge. Pick your targets, boys. Make it count. Bomb bays opened. Torpedoes dropped low. The roar of engines drowned out everything. One after another, the bombs hit home. The carrier Hyo took a direct torpedo amidships. Flames shot skyward as aviation fuel ignited, turning her into a floating inferno. Minutes later, her decks collapsed, spilling aircraft into the sea. Nearby, Zuikaku took multiple hits, her deck crumpling under the impact. Water rushed in faster than the pumps could fight it. Japanese sailors scrambled to abandon ship, their once proud carrier fleet sinking into the same waters where they had once ruled supreme. Above it all, radar-controlled fighters still circled, their instruments guiding them home through clouds of smoke and rain. Even as night fell, radar kept the American formations linked, each plane a node in an invisible web of precision. On the bridge of the USS Bunker Hill, Admiral Mark Mitcher gave the order few had ever dared at night. Turn on the lights. Bring our boys home. Against every wartime rule, the American carriers illuminated their decks, thousands of lights blazing across the sea like a floating city. Guided by radar beacons, the returning aircraft found their way through the blackness. Pilots landed one after another, fuel tanks nearly dry, some gliding in on fumes. The crew cheered as the last Hellcat touched down. By morning, the Pacific was silent again. Smoke drifted over the water where the Japanese fleet had been. Oil slicks shimmered in the sun. Of Japan's 9 carriers that entered the battle, 3 were sunk, 6 crippled, and over 600 aircraft destroyed. It wasn't just a defeat. It was annihilation. Historians would call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese called it something else. The day their navy died. And all of it, every decision, every interception, every strike, had been guided by a technology they once mocked, radar. That night, aboard USS Lexington, radar operator Robert Macaulay sat alone in the CIC, watching the fading green echoes on his screen. The battle was over. The blips were gone. He reached out and touched the glass, his reflection shimmering against the last fading signal. "They never saw us coming," he whispered. "But we saw everything." Outside, the Pacific stretched endless and dark, the empire of the sun extinguished beneath the pulse of a machine that could see through night, clouds, and arrogance. The laughter of the Japanese admirals had long since faded. Radar, the toy they mocked, had become the eye of God.